We live in an age of profound political disruption.
Qu'est-ce qui permet?
People around the world are hungry for change. A new generation of leaders from across the political spectrum is tearing up the old playbook. On trade, on immigration, on regulation. At the same time, technology is rewriting the playbook, disrupting supply chains, disrupting the idea of currency, disrupting how global business gets done.
These technologies are reshaping the economy before our eyes.
These changes are opening new horizons. The companies that harness the next wave of innovation will grow faster. They'll help millions of people lead longer, healthier, more productive lives. But the combination of technology and politics is creating new challenges. Threats to the stability and integrity of elections. Threats to privacy. Threats from state-sponsored hackers armed with weapons-grade code. To deal with these challenges, some countries are building walls, not just physical ones, digital ones that control the flow of information across their borders. In a world where access to entire markets can change with the flick of a switch, choosing the right partner to manage and secure your data has never been more important. Oracle was built for this. Moving to Oracle Cloud means you don't need to patch and maintain dozens of legacy systems to protect your data. It means you don't need to worry that you'll be cut off from your most important customers. Oracle can move your business where it needs to be, and it can do it more efficiently, more securely, and at a lower cost than most companies can do it themselves. It's a new way of thinking in an age where disruption is the only constant.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator for this morning's panel, Mark Hurd.
All right. Oh. Well, that's so kind. Thank you. So this is, I talked about this yesterday a bit in my keynote. This was a panel that we put together that I can't tell you how excited I am to have all of these people with us. So let me start by just introducing who we have with us. And it's not going to actually be in order, but John Scarlett, who's right over here. John served as chief of the British Secret Intelligence Service from 2004 to 2009. He joined CIS in 1971, and over the next 20 years served in Nairobi, Paris, twice in Moscow, as well as assignments spanning covering the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe. In 2001, he retired from CIS on the appointment as chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee in the Cabinet Office. He rejoined CIS as the head of the service in August 2004, where he was responsible for the organization during a period of major shifts in the global balance of power and significant global uncertainty and risk. So, and we'll get into MI6 and James Bond, I think, in a little while, so we can find out what the true story is. Next to John, on the end, is Oracle's chief corporate architect, Edward Screven. Edward is responsible for driving our technology and architecture decisions across all of our products, ensure the product development is consistent across the execution of our strategy, and he also leads our initiatives, including industry standards, and his role really on this panel in security. So he is our chief security officer. Next to me is Jay Johnson, who recently served as Secretary of Homeland Security. Since leaving government in 2017, Secretary Johnson has been called upon to testify, and I feel bad about this for you, Jay, but before Congress in cybersecurity matters numerous times. Secretary Johnson's career has encompassed both private law practice, public service, including 3 Senate-confirmed, we know how tough that is now. Get confirmed by the Senate. 3 Senate-confirmed presidential appointments. So just fantastic to have Jay here as well. Next to Jay is General Michael Hayden. Mike retired as a 4-star general, served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency when, frankly, the course of the world events was changing at probably its most rapid rate. As head of the country's premier intelligence agency, he was on the front lines of global change, the war on terrorism, and the growing cyber challenge. So hard for me to imagine we could get a more esteemed group. And let me just start by thanking all of you for being here. It's frankly an honor for me to share the stage with all of you. So thank you. Let's start by just talking a little bit about yourselves, your background. I mean, I gave a brief little bio, but a little bit about your thoughts about the current state of the world in the context when it comes to intelligence and security. And maybe, Jay, we start with you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. This is terrific. I don't think I've ever spoken to such a large crowd. The last time such a large crowd watched anything I did, I was throwing out a first pitch at a Mets game. I won't tell you whether I threw a ball strike. I served as Secretary of Homeland Security for this country 1,124 days. Wow. I was counting. Yeah. I was hoping to leave at noon on January 20. I had to stay behind for 7.5 hours to serve as the designated survivor during the inauguration. So I served 7.5 hours into the Trump administration. Piece of trivia for all of you. You're looking at the first person to resign from Donald Trump's cabinet. So,
I thought we went through this earlier, that we weren't going to look for cheap laughs, but
stating a statement of fact.
I got it. Thank you.
So before I was at DHS, I was the general counsel of the Department of Defense during the first term, and I have to say I saw the homeland threat evolve significantly just on our watch. Since 9/11, and we're talking security generally, since 9/11, our intelligence community in both the US and the UK, frankly, owing in very large part to the gentleman to my right, is now significantly better at connecting the dots when detecting plots to the US, to the Western world, from overseas. Where we're challenged are the homegrown, self-radicalized actors who radicalize in secret, who are inspired by things they see and read on the internet. Makes for a much more challenging environment, less predictable. It's hard to assess risk in that environment. And frankly, I used to say the cornerstone of our mission has to be counterterrorism, but the other cornerstone has to be cybersecurity. The cyber threat is going to get worse before it gets better, in my judgment. Those on offense, whether they're nation states or criminals or hacktivists or those who engage in ransomware, are increasingly aggressive and tenacious and ingenious. And frankly, those of us on defense in government and in the private sector have to struggle to keep up. And I think we've yet to turn that corner, but that became a big part of my mission, my 3 years in office. We made some strides, some improvements, but there's a lot more to do, particularly in a private-public partnership. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Jay. Mike?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity to be here today. As already suggested, I'm a career military officer, 39 years in the Air Force. The last 10 years at the national intelligence level. So I was a Clinton appointee to NSA and a Bush appointee to CIA, and I actually stayed on for 3 weeks into the Obama administration.
Were you the first person to resign from the Obama?
Actually, yeah, I guess I was.
Yeah.
Not nearly the badge of honor yours is, but
We had that in common. Okay. All right.
We actually went through this, that we didn't want to do this sort of. Anyway, Mike, sorry about you.
So I talk to audiences like this, and sometimes it's a broader global security kind of question. What keeps you awake at night? And I generally begin with one slide that my Army buddies would call the big hand little map slide, where you get to go like that and pretend you're doing something meaningful, right? And I have 3 bullets on that slide that I think kind of level sets where we are in the security in the broadest sense. Number one, I'm old enough, and I'm looking out here, many of you aren't, but I'm old enough to remember a world more dangerous than today's. I am old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm old enough to remember going to DEFCON 3 in 1973 because we thought the Russians were pushing special weapons to their Arab allies during a war in the Middle East at that time. I'm old enough to remember Soviet and American armor barrel to barrel at Checkpoint Charlie in downtown Berlin, a place I can no longer identify, even though I have been at Checkpoint Charlie during during the Cold War. So the world has actually been more dangerous in my lifetime than the current one. It has never been more complicated. And that's coming from someone who actually, even in retirement, spends an awful lot of time just trying to keep up. One very brief example, we could fill up our time together this morning simply describing to you the batting order in the war in Syria. All right? No play-by-play, no commentary, just listing the players would take an awful lot of time. There are a lot of situations globally that are like that. I have never seen it more complicated. And then the final dynamic is, I don't think I've ever seen it more immediate. And that includes an awful lot about what we're going to talk about today, a domain in which almost everything is instantaneous, universal, and so on. But it's just not the interconnectivity of the digital domain. It's just not the ability to see someone's unhappy cell phone video from an unfortunate part of the world this afternoon on some 7x24 news network. I mean no fooling. When something happens here, things go bump over here in an immediate and an impactful way. And so although we've been safer, I think the complexity and the immediacy of the world in which we are now living actually makes it seem even less safe, unstable than it might really be.
Thanks, Mike. John?
Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation, and of course, it is a privilege to be here. I can't help thinking, looking at the size of the gathering, that I spent most of my life trying to stay away from big events and being discreet. So, as you've been told, I am an operational, or I was rather, an operational intelligence officer. That's been my career, and that's how I spent a long time. It's embarrassing now to hear the year in which I actually started in my career, but I will quickly say that I was the second youngest officer in the service when I joined, so that makes me feel slightly better. And I would like actually to pick up what General Hayden just said there about the stability or the safety or the comparative risks and dangers which are out there in the world outside. There is a tendency now to say not only do we live in a world which seems more unpredictable than previously, and that's basically correct, although of course the future is always unpredictable and the past always seems easier because we know what happened. But it is important to say that the Cold War in particular was not a time of stability and predictability. The particular incident that I remember and has been receiving some publicity recently was the nuclear war scare in 1983, November the 8th, November the 9th, to be particular. See, most people don't know about that, but it was the real thing, just for a weekend. Right. And so that was the Cold War. It sure didn't seem stable and predictable at the time. Now I'm out of the service and I'm out of government service, but I'm very conscious of the enormous privilege I had being the chief of our service, the Secret Intelligence Service, the oldest continuously active intelligence service in the world, began in 1909. It was an enormous privilege to lead it, and it's a wonderful organization. But of course, it's constantly living with stress and with responsibility. In my time, we had the terrorist attacks in London on 7/7 June 2005. Living through that was something. But we made a lot of progress, we learned a lot of things, we reacted to it. And we came to understand that terrorist threat. Of course, it's now changed. It's become, in a way, certainly more difficult to monitor and difficult to respond to and difficult to anticipate. And remember, at the end of the day, intelligence and good intelligence is absolutely critical for dealing with the terrorist threat. The best way to stop a terrorist attack is to know about it in advance. That is at the core of so much of our debate. Now, looking out into the Into the future, of course, what we see is the return of great power tensions and great power rivalries. And at the very center of those rivalries is technology, innovation, technological capability, which at the end of the day is a great leveler. The poorest, or arguably the poorest country in the world, can pose serious threats and problems for the biggest and richest country in the world, because technology is a great leveler.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Edward?
My focus, of course, is not keeping nations safe. My focus is keeping Oracle customers' data safe and keeping Oracle's businesses safe by helping build secure products, helping make sure that we build a secure cloud. I think I've been responsible for that for many years. So I've actually been responsible for security at Oracle for about 20 years. And just like the nature of the geopolitical threats in the world have evolved, so have the nature of the cybersecurity threats. When I first became responsible for security, inside Oracle, we had people scanning ports. We had people sending pretty easy to detect, phishing email. Really amateurish, right? It was kind of like, people's in their mother's basement, hacking away. Now it is very, very different. Now the cybersecurity threat is posed by people who are either well-funded criminal organizations, right, or they're state-sponsored, and their motivations are sometimes financial, and their motivations are sometimes political. Their motivations are sometimes intent to do harm to nations by affecting companies that are important. And as that threat has evolved, as that threat has gotten tougher to deal with, we've had to build new technology and figure out ways to respond in ways that aren't manual, that don't have long think times, and that's fundamentally what has changed.
Yeah, thanks. All right, I'm going to ask Jay you a first question, and what I say is, Mike, John, Edward, just chime in addition to that, and we'll try to get as many as we can. Jay, Mike actually mentioned 9/11. I'd make an argument we haven't had a 9/11 from a cyber perspective. Any thoughts on what a 9/11 cyber attack looks like?
That's a good question. In 2012, Leon Panetta gave a speech while I was still working at the Defense Department. It was at the Intrepid Air and Space Museum in New York, where he predicted a cyber 9/11. And, that's a rather provocative term. 9/11, particularly for a New Yorker like myself, conjures up, some really big, bad things. Sure. But given the nature of cybersecurity, a 9/11 scale attack may be something a little more subtle, and it may take years to assess the full impact. Some would argue that what happened to our democracy in 2016 was a cyber 9/11. I personally believe that we still do not know the full extent to which the Russian government engaged in the publication and republication of fake news, extremist views that had an impact on public opinion in 2016. We know that there was scanning and probing activity around voter registration databases, which I was very concerned about when I was in office. But we also know that through access to the internet, our open, free society is our greatest strength, but it's also a vulnerability. We also know that the Russian government engaged in pushing out extremist views and fake news, but we don't yet know the full extent of that. And it was an attack on our democracy, and apparently, from a variety of different sources, the same thing is happening again in connection with our midterms. So we have to think of cyberspace as a battle space now, much like we would think of, you know, a kinetic battle space in traditional terms. And so this is something that people ask me about all the time in my private law practice, my private life now. And I think all of us would agree that cyberspace is really the new battle space. And we need to have, as a national priority, an international priority, the defense of cyberspace. As I said earlier, it's much easier to be on offense than it is on defense in this realm. Yeah. And we've got to do a much better job, in my view, of public-private partnerships in defense of our cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, particularly in this country.
Quick follow-up, how aware were you in 2016 of what we now know was going on at the time?
There was, in the summer of 2016, a rising level of awareness and concern that from a Russian platform, there were efforts made to hack the DNC, scan and probe around voter registration databases. By late summer, we knew that the Russian government was behind the hacking. And as many of you know, on October 7th, there was a big debate about what to do about that. And a number of us felt very strongly that we had to say something to the American public while the campaign was underway. And the Director of National Intelligence and I, on Friday, October 7th, issued the statement making attribution to the Russian government for the hacking. We weren't then in a position to know that the Russian government was behind the scanning and probing of voter registration databases, but we were able to conclude that later. And frankly, the statement did not get the attention that we thought it deserved, because it was crowded out by a number of other things that day, as a lot of people here know. And it was really only until December, after the election, that the mainstream media really got their head around this to say, the Russians interfered in our democracy. And we said, well, yes, we told you that 2 months ago.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts on a cyber 9/11?
Sure. So let me pivot off of the Secretary's comment about the Russians, what the Russians did, because I think that's an important aspect of thinking about the scope of this. And so I got introduced into the digital things in the mid-90s. I've been head of intelligence for U.S. forces in Europe, and frankly, my inbox was filled with the war in the Balkans. Bosnia, Croatia, and so on. And so I was going from a war that was medieval in both its causes and its conduct, and I got reassigned, as happens in the military, to San Antonio, Texas, to take over something called the Air Intelligence Agency. And so I got about, it's kind of the wholesale factory of intelligence for the Air Force. And I have about 17,000 folks. And they were on the cutting edge of thinking about this new cyber thing. And much of what they were thinking in Texas 20 years ago is now American joint doctrine. So I go into this new command, and they never quite said it this way to me, but if you boil down my first week, it was, glad to see you, Hayden. Please sit down, take out a clean sheet of paper and write this down. Land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a domain, it's a place, it's a location. We're going to go fight there. And that actually is now U.S. doctrine. And frankly, you tell a GI that, a lot of tumblers click. Oh, why didn't you say so? It seems so complicated. but now it is a domain of competition, and we'll go do for you in this domain what you expect us to do for you in these domains. Now, there are a lot of differences, but that frames it nicely. But as straightforward as that seems, in Texas in the 90s, we had a grand debate amongst ourselves that would have rivaled the Jesuit faculty at a medieval university debating questions of theology as to whether we were in the cyber business or the information business, whether our task was cyber dominance or information dominance. Now, you know how the movie turns out. We've got a command up the Baltimore-Washington Parkway from Washington called Cyber Command. But the grand debate was, is this about cyber? Computer network defense, computer network attack, computer network espionage, or is it something broader than cyber, of which the cyber thing is a subset, but you've got deception and public information and public diplomacy. So we had this, so what are we after here? And we looked over here at the broader information dominance bubble and frankly said, whoa, that looks really hard. And so this was hard enough. And frankly, I mean, we were quick to realize in our political culture, you don't get to do much of this without bumping into one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, the first and the fourth. And so we've really concentrated, and this is the important part, we think about this through a cyber lens. The Russians went to door number 2. The Russians went to the information dominance bubble. Mm-hmm. And the apostle for this was the fellow who's now chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, who wrote half a dozen years back about modern war being contactless war using informational means against an adversary's target population. Not a bad description of what happened in 2016. So one of our great challenges for the people who do security in the United States is to begin to think through a lens that is not our own. And to begin to think about this in the way they think about it rather than what we do. So too often when we talk about what the Russians did, we only, this is important, but we only talk about hardening the election infrastructure. But that's looking at it through our lens. That's that cyber stuff. Whereas the Russians would view tinkering, in fact, I know in 2016, their probes against the election infrastructure was not to cause physical change there. It was just to mess with our heads here, to make us less confident in the whole process. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is totally agree with what the Secretary said, but the first big idea has to be to get the big ideas right so we actually understand what's going on.
By the way, this whole debate about cyberspace often prompts 2 legal questions. One, when, if ever, is it okay for someone in the private sector to hack back, to defend against an attack? Can you retaliate if you have the capability to do so? The legal answer is generally no, because hacking back itself would constitute a cyber threat or a hack that violates various US laws and probably other laws internationally. But in my view, there ought to be some more legal thinking that goes into this question as our capabilities become more sophisticated. Perhaps that line is not as sharp as some people think it might be. And then the other question is, under what circumstance, and I know Mike has thought about this, under what circumstance can a cyber attack constitute an act of war?
Exactly. But of course, this is the key problem, that there is no international sort of legal structure, or there's no sense of the rules of the game at all. And it's very hard to see how, in fact, they can be developed and agreed on. Because even if they are agreed on, then who is really going to trust all the various sides to implement them? So the lack of an international rules of engagement structure around this area, which we're all saying quite independently, is sort of central to the whole re-emergence of great power, rivalry, and tension, is a really fundamental issue. And I think we have to get our brains into that way of thinking about things differently. Personally, I'm wary of the expression a cyber 9/11. I'm not quite sure what that would mean, and we're slightly thinking in old terms like that. We need to get our brains into a different place. And just to go back to that point about in 2016, I was asked about that at the time. I was in Aspen, in fact, when the DNC hack was just appearing as the news, and I was asked for my reaction to it, and my instant reaction, without really thinking about it, was, why is everybody so surprised? I mean, if you come from my background, in the pre-cyber age, internet age, interference or attempts to interfere in our election systems was absolutely normal practice from the Soviet side in Europe. Every European country had that experience. But here in the United States, it seemed to cause great surprise. And I remember a particular friend of mine saying to me, yes, we know that that's what used to go on in Europe, but this is the United States of America. It's outrageous.
And in trying to decompose what the Russians did, I actually say publicly, remember, I'm a former director of NSA, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I would say, imagine if you will, the theft of the emails is accepted international practice. Okay? That's what adult nations do to one another, okay? They conduct espionage on one another. But I tell the story that if I were still director of NSA, and one of my young operators came running down the hall saying, boss, you won't believe it, we just broke into the email cache of United Russia, which is Putin's party. Now you have to assume that we care what United Russia says because it's a different kind of system, all right? But we've broken into the email cache of United Russia. What should we do? Okay, well the answer is obviously, we'll steal them, okay? And the punchline is, and I would not have had to have made a phone call downtown to get special permission to do that. And what makes the Russian activity in 16 so different is that they went from the cyber espionage box, which is generally accepted international practice, and used that as an enabler, used it as a tool to actually conduct a covert influence campaign against the United States using the stolen data for that purpose. Just one more thought, too, about definitions, John. Recall the Sony North America hack, all right? Kim Jong-un didn't like a movie. Remember that one? Yeah. Yeah, I've seen the movie. He's right, okay? So that was a really egregious attack. Theft of data, destruction of networks, threat of physical harm, all the cyber sins were there. And this is one of the instances where President Obama decided to actually point to the attacker. And he went out into the press room and he gave a really strong speech. And at one point in the speech, he said, and this will not stand, we are going to respond to this, or words to that effect, because this was a particularly vile form of cyber vandalism. And I'm watching the thing and going, vandalism? That's what you do with spray paint on a subway car. This was far worse than that. Come on, Mr. President. Tell the world exactly what this was. This was a particularly vile act of cyber. Now, I do this for a living, and that was 5 years ago, and I have not yet been able to finish my sentence. I don't know what to call what the North Koreans did. Was it an act of war? Nah. Was it an armed attack? Ooh, let's have lunch. We'll talk about it. Did you get the point? There are no generally agreed upon definitions. And by the way, once you agree upon definitions, the responses then become more obvious.
Right.
But we can't agree on the basic definitions.
Yeah.
Generally, what most legal scholars around this question would say is it depends on the effect. So if there's a kinetic physical effect to a cyber attack, like the destruction of a power grid or loss of life, that could be considered an act of war. But what we all need to remember is what's good for one nation is good for another, and could be used to invoke treaty obligations, could be used in self-defense. Yeah. And so those with the greatest capabilities, it's not necessarily in our interest to reach for an aggressive interpretation.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch a little bit. We obviously talked a lot about Russia for the last 10 minutes. We had a political science sort of scholar here who made a point yesterday of saying, listen, Russia's got the GDP that's about 0.7, the state of New York. They're not really, they actually do a pretty good job with the assets they have of staying relevant on the world stage. Again, this is his opinion, I'm not saying mine. He said, but when you compare that to a nation state like China, you have a very different situation. Their economy likely is bigger than the United States is by 2025, 2028, depending on what numbers you believe. They don't invest in, and Mike, you know, in the physical defense of this country, we spend over $700 billion with the new budget. They spend 80. They don't build aircraft carriers, they build cyber teams. So switching it a little bit to looking at a different actor, your view on those capabilities and in the context of how you invest in these various, and Mike, you introduced the thought of different things we do in terms of espionage. How does that work in your mind comparing those two nation states, which have very different characteristics?
Yeah, and this is Ian yesterday, right? Ian Bremmer? Yeah. I totally agree. I describe China as a resurgent power. I describe Russia as a revanchist power. And there are actually 3 American states who individually have economies larger than the Russian Federation: California, New York, and Texas. Now, I get it. We made you guys in California give up your nuclear weapons, okay? But we let the Russians keep theirs. Right? And so there are differences. But Dr. Bremmer is right. In the essential elements of long-term power, Putin has a diminishing hand. I was on Morning Joe 3 years ago. I don't know. Anyway, Putin had done something to make us mad, and we talked about it. And I was in New York, and I was in Washington. They were in New York. And we're about ready to break for commercial. And I said, Joe, can I add one more thing? And he goes, yeah, General, go ahead. What do you got? I said, Joe, you realize he's doing all this, and he doesn't have more than a pair of 7s in his hand? Okay. But he's betting very aggressively, and frankly, we collectively are not calling the pot. So he keeps winning. That doesn't make him less dangerous than the Chinese, actually. It actually might make him, for the near term, more dangerous because he knows he's got a diminishing capacity that he's got to use. The Chinese, on the other hand, growing in power, and I am not reflexive in attaching malevolent intent to everything the Chinese do. A whole bunch of what it is they do are the natural things for nations in their circumstance. So, for example, my little email universe lit up last week with the Chinese Navy exercising with the Thai Navy in the Straits of Malacca as, oh man, here they come. And I'm going, no, that actually is not only okay, that actually might be a good thing. That the Chinese Navy is actually taking some responsibility for the safety of sea lanes on which they depend, particularly in the Straits of Malacca, where piracy is still an international issue. I'll stop, because I know John was nodding and probably has something more to say about both China and Russia, because he served in Russia. But I will share with you that the pass-fail question of American diplomacy for the 21st century is the Sino-American relationship. Get it right, this other stuff will work out. Get it wrong, this other stuff's not going to matter.
Well, I do completely agree with that. I've made several references to the return of sort of great power tension and maneuvering and rivalry. And clearly, at the very center of that is the relationship between the United States and China. In fact, it's a growing theme almost month by month at the moment, as the complexity of the issues which are raised by Chinese, a more assertive China, expressing the power which they have developed. And of course, in particular, in the domain of technology, of innovation, of ambition, made in China 2025, and so on. And again, as a non-American, looking at the United States and the communities, your community, the security and intelligence community, I seem to see really pretty clearly that the sort of sense of agitation and anxiety about this is becoming more and more visible and audible, because for the first time, you can perhaps contemplate a situation where leadership, innovation, technology doesn't automatically find itself in the United States. In fact, it may be in a very dynamic nation state, which really operates on quite a different basis from us. And I think everybody in the sort of Western liberal democracy world really has to think hard about that. And do we really understand it? Understanding what's driving Russia and President Putin and so on is actually probably not so difficult, really. That one can do. At least I feel I can, but then I was there. I think understanding the direction of likely sort of China behavior, very positive, actually, as much of it is in terms of achievement, understanding that and the issues it might raise, much more difficult.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, I'm going to switch gears again. A couple days ago, our founder, Edward, sat on the stage, but now he's actually standing on the stage, and said, we've built a cloud that is impenetrable. I think I'm quoting him. And he indicated whether it's Google, Facebook, the Pentagon, everybody's been attacked at some level of success. First question is, comment on the lack of penetrability of the cloud and why. And then I'd like to engage on, you all know the movement to the cloud in our industry is irrefutable. Just to give you some context, 15, 16% of the data centers in corporate America shut down last year. Data workloads are moving to these bigger enterprise clouds. After Edward gives his answer on our cloud, I'd love your view. Is that good? Is that bad? Do you look at that as increased risk, decreased risk? Edward, why don't you start, and then let's let the conversation ensue.
Well, we've been in the cloud business for quite a while now. We built a first generation cloud in a way which I would describe as pretty conventional, the same way that Amazon built their cloud, the same way that Microsoft built theirs and Google theirs. And we learned a lot from that. And one of the most important things that we learned was that we really need to separate out enforcement of security from the computers that are running services, computers that are running customer applications. So our second generation cloud, what we call OCI, has two different types of computers in it. It has user computers that run either customer code or code that's implementing our services, and control computers. Those control computers sit in between the user computers and the network. So it's like a bump in the wire. So the user computer is connected via Ethernet to the control computer, which is then connected via Ethernet into the network that is the mesh that interconnects every element in our cloud. And the advantage that gives us is that there is no code at all provided by a customer that can touch the control plane of our cloud. There is no code running in that user computer that can access the memory of that control computer. All network access is mediated by that control computer. There's another fact too. Our code running in our control computer, our code running in other servers in the network cannot touch the memory of a computer running customer code. And that's good for you, because it means if in some way some element of our network was compromised, it cannot get into the memory of your computer. We also, running in second generation cloud, are very focused on defense in depth. So we're engineering the services that run as native services in our cloud to provide additional layers of security. So for example, when you run Autonomous Database, your data is encrypted. We don't give you the choice. Your data is always encrypted. We provide to our customers something called CASB. So we actually have security brokers that you can use to monitor access to your systems and use machine learning techniques to understand, are these access patterns similar to what I have had in the past, or are they different, signaling that there may be some kind of threat. I think one of you mentioned that intelligence about an attack that will happen is essential. Well, when it comes to cybersecurity, intelligence that an attack is happening right now is essential. Yeah. And what is really very, very important is to be able to respond to that attack quickly. That's why when we built our second generation cloud, we made sure that we can patch with no downtime. Larry demonstrated on stage that you can patch autonomous database without taking it down, without taking downtime in your application. All of our servers, all of our services are built on top of Oracle Linux using a technology called K-Splice. We can patch all of those servers without taking them down. I'll give you a specific example. You may have all heard of something called L1TF. L1TF is an Intel processor flaw. It was out there for a few months. Vendors like Oracle knew about it. It was finally made public not that long ago. Now, addressing L1TF requires applying patches. We patched every single server in our OCI cloud in less than 24 hours. We did not take a single server down to do it. Customers didn't even know that we had patched the servers. That is the kind of capability that's required if you want to respond to cyber attacks, if you want to be secure in the current state of the world.
Anything you want to add on encryption?
Yeah, I mean, encryption is of course, like I said, we don't let you turn off encryption. We don't let you turn off other sorts of security features, in our services, especially in the database. And I'll give you just a sort of an anecdote about the importance of database encryption. We acquired a company that operates
one of my favorites.
Yeah, okay, it's in the retail sector. Okay, and of course, being part of the retail sector, they collect credit card data and all kinds of other sensitive things that, of course, hackers would really like to get because they're valuable. And this company, they had been somewhat disorganized. They had not really taken this sort of rigorous approach to security that we do naturally at Oracle, and of course they do now because we acquired them. And what we found is they had suffered a breach, thoroughly breached. I mean, their systems were basically owned by the attackers, but they had turned on encryption in the database. So the one thing they did right was they turned on encryption in the database. And what that meant is even though the systems were breached, I mean, just owned, the attackers did not get the credit card data because they had used encryption. And it's a unfortunate fact, right, that many of our customers, even if they own the security features of our products, they're licensed. They don't have to pay any extra money to use them. They don't turn them on. They don't turn them on. And there was an incident, a couple years back where there was a horrible breach at the Office of Personnel Management, where attackers came in and they stole very sensitive information about people, including people who have security clearances. So this is a breach that affected some people on this stage. So personal information about some of us, right, released to these hackers. So after analyzing the attack, what we found is that if that customer had turned on the security features they already owned, this wouldn't have happened. And so I think one difference between Oracle Cloud and the way many customers run their operations is we do not have any option to turn security off. You always use security features that we have. You always use the natural security that's built into our Oracle Cloud infrastructure.
And my guess would be less than 1% of the data that sits in Oracle databases today in the marketplace is encrypted. So it's a very small amount. But now, I'd like comments because clearly what's happening is more data, valuable data, information, is getting concentrated in these enterprise clouds. Good news is there's a lot of expertise in these enterprise clouds to go fight bad guys. Mm-hmm. You could flip it around to say, but there's more concentration of this data in one place. So, Jay, thoughts?
So the Department of Defense is in the midst of thinking about this issue too, and this is one of the subjects that I had the pleasure of testifying about in my private life before Congress. And my answer is it depends on what you're coming from. If you've got stored in your own garage some really valuable stuff, but you don't have a first-rate security system, but somebody then offers you a common storage area with state-of-the-art security, you might consider moving your most valuable items to that larger storage facility. The risk obviously is it's a security system in common to a lot of people. You breach it for somebody, it could be breached for others. But I think it's all relative. It depends on what you're coming from. That's how I look at it.
Yeah, I got first introduced to this right about the turn of the century. I remember I'm a director of NSA, but I'm not a technologist. I'm a liberal arts major, right? And so my folks come in and start talking to me about the cloud and how this dynamic is now propagating throughout the world. And my best liberal arts form, I go, tell me about this again. And they do this, and yeah, in one place. And at one point, I know I might remember what I was, the director of NSA. At one point, I must have sounded like that character from The Simpsons, you know? They're going to put all this in one place? Excellent. But as it played out, if people made security one of the discriminating aspects of how they went to the cloud, and not just scale or convenience or cost or latency, but if they made security one of the discriminators, invariably they ended up with better security than they would get in their basement and in their own server farm because of the economies of scale, the better technology that then were available in communizing security. And so it actually made the targets of the world much more difficult. Again, as long as people didn't make dumb decisions as to how they went to the cloud.
Well, John, any thoughts?
Well, nothing much to add to that, except that, of course, you know, the point is how much priority and discrimination are people giving to security when they make their decisions. So people talk about it a lot, but in practice, when they take decisions, is it really at the top of their list? I suspect, you know, very often it's not.
I just make one editorial comment. I don't think there's anybody in the audience that's with I mean, these are, in most cases, some of the most sophisticated companies in the world. I doubt there's a company here that doesn't take it extremely seriously and of the highest priority. Part of it is it's just simply hard. When you get into the way IT has evolved, it's evolved as an open environment. Part of what happened over the last 25 years is people buying disparate products, disparate servers, disparate operating systems, disparate databases, and they all sort of connect together. And therefore, those open up lots and lots of individual pathways in the corporate system. So I don't think there's any disregard for the importance of it.
Obviously not here, and I'm not trying to suggest that, but just when one thinks of the multitude of companies and businesses and entities, that's what I mean. Yeah.
While we're, John, with you, you guys all did something very interesting in the UK. You put cameras all around the city of London. And I'd love to get your view when you were running MI6. Did that work?
Well, in the immediate answer, in a way, is that in spite of the presence of cameras and CCTV and so on in London, let's say, the level of street crime and casual violence and so on is sadly rising, and so one can't say that it's solving the problem, but then you have to consider obviously what would be the case if that capacity wasn't there. I often find this remarked on by American friends and colleagues, the CCTV presence around British cities. And of course, we had a very striking example of it recently in Salisbury, which in a way is the sort of last place you'd expect to find that kind of surveillance taking place. And yet the images which were projected of the Russian tourists who come to admire the spire at Salisbury Cathedral, as they were walking along the streets, you know, in various places, was a graphic illustration of what, you know, that can do. And it should be, in those very tragic circumstances, a reassurance. One of the things that interested me, though, you know, in terms of the general public reaction to the publicity and the appearance of those photos, which got worldwide coverage, was that certainly at home, I don't think I heard anybody, worrying about it or saying, wow, do we really have that kind of surveillance on our streets? I may be misjudging it, or I may be coming from a slightly subjective angle, but really in the UK, so people don't look at the state in that way. There isn't an automatic or worry that somehow the state is going to bear down on us or represent some sort of fundamental threat to our liberties and our freedom and our privacy. Of course, some people do worry about it, but it is a clear minority. And that is, I think it is a reflection of our history, that in our history, the state has not been, has never been seen, or at least not for hundreds of years, a threat in that way. So people don't sort of think about it as the big problem on the privacy side. Whereas, of course, in the United States, and this might have something to do with the British, actually, the Constitution really expresses, concern about the state as this a fundamental part of your constitutional order. Well, we don't have a constitution, but in any case, the mentality just is different.
Right. By the way, if you don't think this job's difficult, I have to get handlers signaling me all the time and keep one eye open on when I'm supposed to accelerate and speed this up. So I've got one of those hand motions. But I got a couple more questions I'd like to get to. In this conference, we're talking a lot about a thing called machine learning, artificial intelligence, things that are going to accelerate knowledge processes at extreme levels that, frankly, we've never seen before in our lifetime. Those technologies will be in the hands of certainly all of these companies, deployed by us into almost all our applications. To be blunt, it'll be in the hands of other people too. Any thoughts? Maybe Mike, we start with you. Any thoughts on the evolution now? We talked a little bit about encryption that'll protect the data, but now AI, machine learning will be propagated over the next 2-3 years in virtually everything we do.
So this may be more a reflection of my not knowing rather than it being unknown.
Yeah.
But certainly for me, though, there is a great unknown. And this happens a lot. And when we talked about an area of competition, an area of conflict, we both use those terms, Secretary. And so if you think in those terms, there are technological developments throughout history that affect the battle space. But the effect on the battle space is very often unpredictable. And so you get more rapid fire weapons during the American Civil War, for example, that should really have instructed the virtues of the defense in the First World War, but didn't. But the virtues of the defense in the First World War were so dominant that in the Second World War, somebody forgot about the discontinuity created by armor attacks. And I mean, so you get this change. I just lack the competence to judge what AI and machine learning will do in cyber competition. My hope is, my instincts tend that it will favor the defense, because Lord knows the defense is so disadvantaged now, any change in the environment would seem to make it better, but I can't guarantee it. And I just can't say that for sure. So that for those of you who are actually working on this, that might actually be a question in the back of your mind. Is that which I am creating here, are there internal decisions to be made in how I develop it that would actually make it a more powerful tool for the defense as opposed to the offense?
Yeah, I'd say, I think to me it seems very clear that machine learning and AI is a more effective tool for defense than offense. It's much easier to automate attacks than it is to automate defense. And so using machine learning, using AI, it lets us recognize that an attack is happening and respond at a speed which is far faster than human beings can make a decision.
So and this comes from a point you made earlier about resiliency and response as opposed to non-vulnerability and defense. Yeah. And everything we experienced in NSA and certainly in my post-government life is you have to view this as a meeting engagement. You have to have complete situational awareness. Yep. You have to fight the fight all the time. Yep. It's recovery, resiliency, response, not just narrowly defined defense. And so if artificial intelligence makes the response quicker, because the defense is already disadvantaged in that, then that's obviously a good thing.
Yeah, I think there has been a kind of asymmetry between attack and defense, right? So because it's been easier to automate attacks, right? The whole question of, okay, a few strongholds versus a lot of spread out, little bunkers, okay? Because it's been easy to automate attacks, the spread out bunker strategy, which is basically, what corporate IT has been like, okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because if there is any vulnerability at any one of those little bunkers, right, they will find it. Yeah.
So
right? Whereas if we have a few strongholds, right, where we have good ML techniques that are watching all the time, right, we have homogeneous architecture and infrastructure, right, we have good management control, right, then that I think is far, far more secure.
Jay?
I think we have to be aware of the shortcomings of AI. We're doing a lot to encourage, in the legal profession, younger lawyers to use it. So, for example, through AI, you can figure out a judge's won-loss record. How often does a judge rule in favor of plaintiffs versus defendants, and then presumably draw some inference from that? This is a pro-defendant judge or a pro-plaintiff judge, but that may be more of a statement of the judge's particular caseload than anything else. And somebody's got a great tool where you can identify a case that a particular judge cites most often in his decisions. Inference being, well, the judge must be in love with that case. It may be that the judge simply has a spate of prisoners' rights cases where they're all denied, and they do a cut and paste job in their opinions and cite the same case over and over again because they're making basically the same ruling over and over again. So I think there are overuses of AI, and we have to be aware of the shortcomings.
Yeah. One thing, I gave a keynote 6 months ago at a conference in Europe right after Stephen Hawking. And as I've told our folks, that was a bad decision. Because his view of AI was really not, to your point, Jay, a little bit, the machine will quickly do a very good job at history. It'll do a very good job at taking everything you know and putting it back to you with amazing efficiency. But machine learning then implies it will learn, and it will get smarter, and it will begin to make decisions. And Hawking's view, of course, was in the end, the machines will figure out the least efficient things on the planet are us humans. And that eventually us humans will go away and the machines will run the world. By the way, after you hear that speech and then you get up like me and talk about applications and platforms, most of the crowd starts filing out. So it wasn't all that fun. But his view was, this will keep learning. You will have continuous learning on the part of the computers, and it will become more and more sophisticated as time goes on. So I'll leave that. We're getting close to being out of time, and what I'd love to do is maybe get a wrap-up set of thoughts from each of you on the direction you think this is headed as it relates to it. And again, we have a very big corporate audience here. We do have public sector attendees as well, global, and certainly the predominant theme at this conference is the maturation of cloud, the maturation of enterprise cloud, the concentration of workloads that are coming to the cloud, the security around that. That's probably been as big a theme as anything we've talked about this week. The advent of AI and and machine learning into those applications, and then and also all the threats we're talking about. So any thoughts or tips you have for all of attendees would be fantastic. Maybe John, I'll start with you.
Well, I, of course, come from a world where security, secrecy, the need to really protect at an absolute possible extent what you really need to protect. I mean, it's just sort of basic. You can't survive and prosper in that world unless you know how to keep your secrets, basically. That's what you want to be secret. So the key point is, I mean, the world we're describing is changing, it's changing. It's attack, it's defense, it's attack. That's going to continue to evolve one way or the other. But it's very rapid change, And we just don't know exactly how it's going to develop. So the key sort of philosophical point is somewhere being completely clear about what it is you really need to protect. And make sure that you've got that absolutely covered. And that's my entire professional experience. At the end of the day, you're not able to protect everything, actually. But I know that's complicated when you get into the cloud and combining, and I very much am persuaded by a lot of what's said there. That's where we are at our present technological stage. But the central point is just be clear in your mind what you really need to keep protected and secret. And if you get that right, then you'll probably be able to manage everything else.
Before Mike or Jay, you answer, I'd insert one other thing into the discussion. Do you think in your time, in certainly the roles you had, there's the right skills to deal with all this, the amount of people, resources? Because I talked a little bit yesterday in my keynote, 60% of the jobs in IT 5 years from now haven't been invented yet. All of these new technologies are going to take people from what we're going to think of now as rudimentary tasks today onto new opportunities in the future. But that's a massive skill set change in what we have today. So as you think about this, I mean, your thoughts on what you observed in terms of skill sets, resources. I think this crowd would also there's a bit of a threat now with all of from a job perspective, machine learning is going to do what I do today, or AI is going to do what I do today. The amount of resources needed to deal with what we're going to deal with in the future, this pales in comparison to the opportunity.
So my answer to that question is, across certain segments of our national security community, the answer is yes. There's some very, very impressive young talent, NSA, United States military, Cyber Command, our intelligence community. We're more challenged in the civilian agencies, the law enforcement agencies, where frankly, our best talent is recruited over to, say, financial services simply because they pay better.
Sure.
So my pitch is always serve your country for a few years, get the insights of national security, homeland security, and then you can go work at Goldman Sachs or Citigroup. But in certain parts of our government, we definitely are challenged in terms of retaining and recruiting the talent to keep pace with the challenges.
Yeah. Obviously, somebody from Goldman Sachs or Citigroup is in the audience. Mike.
Yeah, just final thought category. I think those of us involved in this need to occasionally kind of examine our conscience because the answers probably aren't as obvious as we think they are. Back to the earlier point I think all of us have made about we don't even have the big ideas lined up yet as to what we mean by things. In my life experience, I had a bit of an epiphany as a fairly new director at NSA, and the crisis of the moment was export of supercomputers. And could we export supercomputers above a certain level of power, MTOPS, millions of theoretical operations per second? And I got called down to the White House because Cray was complaining about export controls. And I met with key members of President Clinton's staff. John Podesta chaired the meeting, and we were the stumbling block. I mean, NSA views computing power as combat power. We're not in the business of passing it out around the world. And so we had the export limitations. And Podesta asked us to reconsider that. So we went back to Fort Meade, and we really did have a serious meeting. And I went back to the next meeting in the Situation Room and said, we've changed. Cray can export anything they want except to these 2 or 3 countries. So it wasn't computing power we were limiting, just a few bad actors, we didn't want to have it. And the rationale behind that was a changing definition of what constituted security. In other words, it wasn't denying another actor computing power so we could win a transient tactical operational engagement. Right. It was preserving the strength of the American computing industry on which we would have to rely over the long term for our success. I used that experience in talking about the encryption battle over the cell phone at San Bernardino, where you had Tim Cook versus Jim Comey. And it might surprise this audience that this former director of NSA, two other former directors of NSA, a former Secretary of Homeland Security, and a former head of the National Counterterrorism Center sided with Apple, not on privacy grounds, he's dead, Fourth Amendment doesn't apply, nor commercial grounds, but on a broader definition of security. And it's a difficult issue, and honest people will disagree. And oh, by the way, Jim Comey's requests were totally legitimate. But in our view, the cost of conceding exceptional access outweighed the benefits of exceptional access in this case, all within the confines of thinking about security. Now, we could be right, we could be wrong. There could be other circumstances when we're all for exceptional access because of the physical threat that's entailed. But again, I would just simply invite you to, again, examine conscience. Don't be quite so reflexive in your point of view. And for God's sake, that which I just described is never a combat between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. It's a discussion among free people trying to balance things, both of which they'd like to have in full measure: privacy and security and freedom and liberty.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the... I'm conscious of the time there, but that's absolutely, there's no simple answer. It's really important that we don't adopt simple positions and, you know, we're absolutely on this side or absolutely on the other side. Clearly what Mike is saying is really wise and thought through, and there'd hardly be anybody better to say it. At the same time, you have to recognize that we have security is, and preserving security is part of our liberty, and is part of our privacy. So it's very subtle. And just be aware of that as we think this through in the future. Somehow we have to find a way forward.
Edward, I'll let you have a closing thought.
Yeah, so I think Jay, you said, you described cyberspace as a battlefield, and I think that's right. I think it's a battlefield, and one difference is that there's really no such thing as a civilian, right? I mean, if you're an IT professional, you're on that battlefield, right? You're a combatant, right? And you need to make the right security choice every day, because if you don't, then you're putting your business at risk, you're putting your government at risk, you're putting yourself personally at risk. And it's, the threat is significant. I mean, it's grave and it's persistent, and it's never going to go away. As long as human beings have different interests from each other, there's going to be struggle. And because we're so dependent on computing technology, that struggle is going to extend into cyberspace. But with that said, I'm actually very optimistic, right? I think we've gone through a period of time when attackers had the advantage. Attackers had the advantage because, our defenses were divided, right, and our responses were slow, and we're not applying the best kinds of technologies we could to solve the problem. But I think, like, with the kind of technologies that Oracle has developed in OCI, in our Gen 2 data center, the kind of technologies we can offer our customers, I think we can be much more effective at defending against that threat.
Impenetrable. Impenetrable.
Impenetrable.
Impenetrable. All right, listen, Jay, thank you. Mike, thank you. John, Edward, fabulous. We haven't done a lot of this at OpenWorld, this sort of format, and to be frank, I wish I could have been in the audience listening as opposed to having to deal with the questions. I just thank you profusely for spending your time with us this morning, and please give these folks just a wonderful hand.